Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning into this conversation today. So the goal of this conversation is to talk about anti-Blackness. We want to have a discussion about foundational theories, authors, and texts revolving around the structural antagonism of anti-Blackness. And to introduce myself, my name is Abbie Booker, and I'm an argument and research specialist who works for the Debate Boutique. So I really hope you all enjoy. And just as a disclaimer, this conversation is meant to be as interactive as possible. So there will be times where I will ask everyone to pause the video to go ahead and think about some concepts. So feel free to talk about them with each other, bounce ideas off of each other, make this as interactive as possible so that way it can help you digest all of the concepts and conversations that we'll be having, because we're going to cover a lot of different information in categories. So to begin, I would like to go over our overall objectives for today. So first, of course, we want to leave here having a foundational understanding of what is anti-Blackness. We want to talk about its history, its current context, its material effects, what anti-Blackness means as a structural antagonism. So the goal is that everyone can leave here at least explaining what is anti-Blackness. To help us understand anti-Blackness, that leads us into our second goal, where we want to leave here having a general understanding of theories and their authors and texts that revolve around anti-Blackness. Now, anti-Blackness has tons of different tangents and subcategories that are used to theorize the positionality of Blackness in context of civil society. But we're going to investigate 4 different categories that I find to be very influential, foundational to the conversation of anti-Blackness, and also are very prominent in debate. So we're going to talk about Afro-optimism, Afro-pessimism, Afrofuturism, and Black feminism. And again, that's not to say that these categories of anti-Blackness outweigh any other categories or conversations revolving around anti-Blackness, such as Black queer theory or Black disability politics. But these are just going to be the ones that we fit in today because they do help us provide some of those foundational understandings of what is anti-Blackness as a structure. And lastly, we also want to become familiar with how anti-Blackness relates to other racial identities and structural positionalities. That being said, there will be some ebb and flow between the conversations, especially when we're talking about other identities in contrast to anti-Blackness. Then we're going to use some of the authors and some of their theories to help explain those positionalities. But to clarify at the end, we're going to make sure to readdress all of our objectives, so that way we can make sure that we covered all the topics and can leave here having a clear, concise understanding of what it is that we're talking about. Okay, so this is going to be the first time that I'm going to ask everybody to go ahead and pause the video. And I would like us to take a second and think about all of these definitions, because we're going to use these different terms throughout our conversation. And some of the terms we're probably very familiar with, and some of the terms we may have not sat here and thought critically about before. So we want to make sure that, we kind of give ourselves a chance to be like, okay, where am I at? Do a self-assessment. How do you use these terms? How do you understand these terms? What do these terms mean to you in terms of their material effects? So feel free to pause right now and talk with each other about the possible definitions for each of these 5 terms. Okay, I hope I've given you some time to pause the video. I don't want to sit here and stare at y'all awkwardly for 3 minutes, but I'm going to continue on. And if you didn't get a chance to, then just pause it, rewind when you have time to, or rewind, and then we can continue on. So anyway, next, let's identify these definitions. So first, what is prejudice? Prejudice is having an homogenizing belief about a general group. So when you have a prejudice about someone or something, then you have a idea, assertion, philosophy, something, a belief, something about a generalized population that you think is true. But it's typically based on stereotypes or flawed knowledge. Prejudice does not have to do specifically with race. You can have prejudice towards a gender, a sexuality. You can have prejudice towards a religious identity. But that being said, prejudice, again, does not have political or structural organizations that uphold and support and allow for that belief to be violently enacted onto someone's subjectivity. So while you may have an opinion and it may cause hurt feelings for somebody, it doesn't target their subjectivity and able to project their will into the world. So an example of prejudice is the term "all men are trash." which I'm sure a lot of us have heard, especially in the context of social media. I find myself culpable of using this term as well. But the phrase "all men are trash" is a idea homogenizing belief, something that can be categorized as a prejudice, whether or not it's justified or not justified, which is something that we can get into later. The ability to be culpable for having a prejudice, we'll talk about later, but whether or not it's justified or not, and then structural reasons as to why people use the phrase "all men are trash," we recognize that even though we have this phrase, it's not causing a law or policy to be formed that prevent men from being able to access the world. They still have the highest paying job, they still are paid more than women are paid, and things like assault continues to be not only underreported, but not face the consequences that it should face. So in terms of structures, men are in the position of power, women are not in the position of power. So when we use the phrase "all men are trash," then it doesn't allow for us to inflict violence onto their subject location. Now, that's what gives us a difference between prejudice and racism. So racism is prejudice based on race plus power. And that plus power is that key distinction for what racism is, which is a reason that Black people are not able to be racist. And that can often be a very controversial conversation, but that's what makes a difference between prejudice and racism. And that's why we want to be very intentional about the language that we are using during this conversation. So that way we can start to theorize about how structures actually materially manifest and influence the ways that we are able to assert our own will and our own identity into the world. So when somebody has the ability to enact their assumption and there's a structural there's structures in terms of politics, economics, et cetera, supporting them, then that's when it shifts from prejudice to racism. This also can be a subconscious act where someone has an opinion that goes against the norm. And when I say the norm, unfortunately, we have to recognize the norm of our society is racism, is anti-Blackness, right? It is sexism, it is patriarchy, it is, homophobia, transphobia. We live in a society that normalizes violence. So when you go against the norm, it sounds reversed or opposite, because that's when you're saying, hey, I'm an anti-racist and I believe this is wrong, right? So when an individual goes against the norm, they do not have the ability to assert that will in terms of a structural relationship, or there will always be a correction of their thought, whether they wish for that to happen or not. So an example of this can be done in terms of somebody who is applying for a job, right? So if a white person is applying for a job and they think it's wrong, that structurally it's been proven that job officials are less likely to give a job to somebody or an interview to somebody who has a more ethnic name. If there's a white person applying for a job and they're like, hey, I think that's wrong that you wouldn't give this job to somebody or the interview to somebody just because they have an ethnic name. At the end of the day, they're still applying for a job, right? You apply for the job, that white person does not have control over the system, the reviewers, the agency looking at the resumes and deciding, hey, we're going to go with this person because they appear and present themselves in a more white way than this person based on their name. And so subconsciously, they were still involved in a racist act, even if they disagree with that ideology, right? So it's not an individual choice to participate in racism, which is why white privilege, for example, it's not something that you can choose to have or not have. It's something that involves a overarching structure. It's systemic. So racism, again, it's prejudice plus power, but then it's also not an individual choice, and it can be subconscious acts of racism, whether or not you want to be involved in them. Now, for anti-Blackness is the structures and actions that are based in dehumanizing, devaluing, and inflicting violence onto Black life. Anti-Blackness is a global structure that justifies violence onto otherized bodies based on their proximity to Blackness. Anti-Blackness is what gives coherency to colorism, to imperialism, to Islamophobia, and more. It works in tandem with structures such as settler colonialism and classism or capitalism very closely. It's the foundations for the existence of civil society or modernity today. So when we talk about anti-Blackness, one of the things that we'll explain more as we go, and it'll become more clear, is that anti-Blackness doesn't just target based on skin color, right? When we say proximity to Blackness, it's because it targets Black culture, it targets Black history, it targets Black language, it targets Black appearance, it targets so many aspects, the entire being of what it means to be Black. So when anti-Blackness is a globalized structure, that's what allows for it to target other groups based on their proximity to Blackness, based on shared values and relationships that other groups may have with Black people. But we'll definitely dive into that more as we go. Next, Blackness, right? Blackness is the flesh. Blackness is the history, the kinship, the culture, the shape of what it means to be a Black individual. While Blackness is positive, it is these markers that are used by anti-Blackness to target Black life and Black existence. This is why anti-Black violence, again, is not just based on your flesh, but it targets the entirety existence of what Black people, of what makes up Black people. So in some literature, when they refer to Blackness, they're referring to it specifically in the context of the ways that Blackness was cemented via chattel slavery. Other times, people will refer to Blackness as the global African diaspora. So the important part of that delineation is when we talk about Afro-pessimism or Afro theories in general, in terms of like Afro-pessimism, Afro-optimism, and Afro-futurism, these are looking at anti-Blackness in a context that was changed after the Middle Passage. That's not to say that they aren't globalizing structures, that like Blackness is not a globalizing structure that every Black individual from different Black communities and countries have, but rather that there was a cementing of what Blackness meant after the Middle Passage that impacts and is inflicted onto all of these Black communities. Now, in contrast to Blackness, whiteness, it would seem like whiteness is like white culture then, but no, it's not. Whiteness is referring to institutions and structures that uphold white supremacy. So these are structures that uphold privilege and for white folk and put white as the superiority in terms of the value system. Often this system works in tandem with anti-Blackness, but they are silent movers. The project of whiteness is to normalize white supremacy, which means it's invisible, yet it's also absolute. So a way that we can conceptualize whiteness is in terms of the classroom. So let's think about, I'm sure we've all been there, an English class, whether it was in high school, college, middle school, but an English class where we read the great literature works of America. And as we're going through these works, we're talking about things like Shakespeare. We are going to talk about things that we're going to talk about, like different movies that were created. We're going to talk about different poetry that was used. We're going to talk about Enlightenment theory, right? We're going to read all of these foundational works that shape the cultural American literature experience. We might dive into some musicals such as Oklahoma and the difference between how musicals were then versus musicals now, such as Wicked. But as we do this, we might toss in a little bit of diversity, such as the Poisonwood Bible or the Kite Runner, or we might add, To Kill a Mockingbird, to add some perspective of culture, right? Add a little bit of spice into it. That's the normalization of whiteness. So what it's saying subconsciously, or not subconsciously, but without actually using the word, without vocalizing it, is that white literature is what makes American literature. To be American, to be American culture, to be American theory, it is, you are white. It is white. It must be a white thing, right? So if we are looking at other identities, other experiences, that's when we vocalize it. We'll say, hey, we're going to read the book, the Poisonwood Bible, so that way we can begin to understand how other people view missionaries in the Congo. So that expressing of the Blackness is what otherizes the Blackness, but then normalizes the whiteness because the whiteness does not need to be vocalized. That being said, to help challenge whiteness, it's something that has to be called out. It always needs to be pointed out as a structure because, again, it's a silent mover. But also, we'll talk more about that as we go into the theories. Okay, let's continue on and dive into the juiciness of this lecture. So first, let's talk about the concept of Blackness. So the concept of race, right, was not initially coined until the 16th century. And when we say race, we recognize that race is like a human-made, man-made category. So when race was finally coined as the term, this coincided with an increase in mass expeditions and explorations of different areas of the world. It also coincided with the ending of the Enlightenment era. So during this time, we have Christopher Columbus colonizing the Caribbean and South America. We have the English who are exploring Africa. Merchants are establishing trading posts in North Africa. And we also recognize that if we go around the tip of Africa, then we can get to India to engage in trading. And also, the Silk Road is just coming to an end due to these mass explorations, which was originally this prime mean of economic networking across the continent. So as international relations developed, the need for state recognition and a sense of establishment as a sovereign nation was also required. So throughout history, communities had used Blackness to contrast themselves, to make comparisons and contrasts between themselves and Black individuals. We have the Arab slave trade that shipped sub-Saharan Africans throughout Europe. So there was this color scale, this color spectrum in which certain lighter populations were ranked themselves above that of the African community. Then we also have the battles against colonization and religious persecution that were happening throughout Africa, uprisings by those who were enslaved. And while we saw that, slavery was abolished in Ireland in the early 1200s, England continued to capture and transport hundreds and thousands of African slaves every year. Now, this is all prior to the Middle Passage, but it was these engagements that started to lay the foundations for the global recognition of what it means to be Black, or what is Blackness. Now, to continue on, the Middle Passage is the time in history that really cemented what Black means in terms of a larger value structure. So for powerful nations such as England, Spain, and France to legitimize their state, they colonized, exploited, and genocided Black and Indigenous communities around the world. They created this value of exchange, which cemented the idea of race, because there was a need to classify what was valuable in terms of its human existence, the white body, and what was invaluable, which becomes Blackness. So the need to be legitimized, the need to set borders, to be able to claim space, which is what these nations had the goal of. They purposefully had to create an other, something that was less than them, a value of England, Spain, France up here, and everything else beneath them. And that is what allowed for the start of the Middle Passage, because it was decided through the exploration and engagement with Black culture and Black community that African people would be the ones to be used for slavery. So while this new concept of race was formulating through the Enlightenment era, the shipping of African slaves to England evolved into the transatlantic slave trade. And at this point, Indigenous communities were either being genocided or they maintained some sort of land-based productivity for colonizers, in which their understanding of the land that they occupied had some type of value that they could not be fully eradicated, but they were forced to be cleared. And eventually, when they were no longer of use, that's when we start to see an attempt to half incorporate Indigenous people into society, but they're still on the outskirts in terms of being forced to be relocated to the reservation. But anyway, back to the idea of the Middle Passage, right? So during this time of the Middle Passage, we now have, after Indigenous people were cleared from the lands, Africans being shipped to these areas to now build up these nations. And the narrative of their enslavement became like no other. During the Middle Passage, the acts of violence, alienation, and severance of kinship formed the African into the chattel Black. There was a transformation process in which a new race, a new ethnicity was created. And that position was bound to the position of Blackness, and it bound Blackness to the position of the slave. So the Middle Passage became cemented a value exchange system that resided in both gratuitous the gratuitous need to eradicate Blackness from existence, while also the desire to use Black flesh to give whiteness its subjectivity. By marking Black flesh at the least valuable in terms of life, but also the most valuable in terms of plantation productivity, it positioned Blackness in terms of this paradoxical position, which made becoming Black the slave the least desirable identity to occupy. So what that means is that to be Black, to be valuable in terms of productivity, but not valuable in terms of your life, your existence outside of what you can produce for the state, you are forced to live an eternal life of torture. It becomes intergenerational, right? So even after you have children, there's no hope for a slave that your children may be able to go on and live a better life, because they as well will be born into the position of the slave. It's literally the concept of hell for Christianity, like legitimized and brought onto the plane of the earth. Eternal suffering, eternal torture, right? That was what the position of the slave was. And that is why being in this position of the paradox was the lowest value position to occupy. So that being said, we kind of have an understanding now of what the concept of Blackness is and a little bit about its history, how Blackness isn't something that just came to be during the Middle Passage, but it was evolving throughout history as early as 500 to 600 AD, right? With exploration and relationships between other countries, they needed to solidify their own identity in opposition to other identity. And this is what allowed for the Middle Passage to be what it was, the changing of the African into the chattel Black. And through that transformation process and through the violence inflicted onto the slave, it gave coherency to this new value system in which Black was at the very bottom of that exchange, and we had white as a superior in purity top at the very top of this exchange system. Alrighty, so to continue on, now we're going to kind of dive into some of the theories around anti-Blackness, now that we have a little bit of an understanding of what anti-Blackness is. So first, we're going to talk about Afro-optimism, and I'm going to spend the least amount of time covering Afro-optimism simply because it's often the conversation or theory that we have the most familiar, like we're most familiar with, even if we don't recognize it. So first, what is Afro-optimism? Afro-optimism is the belief that it is possible for things to get better for the position of Blackness within the world as we know it. That if we continue to pick ourselves up by the bootstraps and play the political game, we will eventually reach the end goal of integrating Black people into civil society. And then being recognized as equal to white people, we'll be able to give humanity to the Black body, right? We'll give political agency, we'll give the ability to have civic duties and civic roles to the Black body. But we will not have to structurally change the world radically as we know it. So this is not to say that Afro-optimism, sorry, not pessimism, but this is not to say Afro-optimism does not hold skepticism toward the state, right? But through coalition politics, we'll be able to make political shifts that allow for Black people to fully access the civic agency and not just necessitate an abolition of the world as we know it. So what this means also is that Blackness is not in an ontological position which means it's not in a permanent antagonistic position within civil society. Blackness does not always have to face violence for coherency to be given to the state. So that means that Blackness does not exist in the permanent position of the oppressed, and it doesn't have to consistently endure violence. Also, it means that if Blackness is not ontological, then even if the holistic identity can never be returned, it still means that Blackness will be able to gain some new form of humanity. So even if we can't, rebuild those relationships that chattel Black people had with their home countries and home families, they will still be able to gain some new form of life, identity, and community within America that is not constantly not constantly being targeted. So what this means is while Afro-optimism can recognize the natal alienation and severance of culture and kinship, it does not equal to this, again, permanent position of violence. So a way that I often conceptualize Afro-optimism is Malcolm X in contrast to MLK. So MLK would represent Afro-optimism, which is why we typically have an understanding of what Afro-optimism is, even if we don't always identify Afro-optimism as a theory. So MLK felt that through political engagement, then he would be able to assert the will of the Black community and enfold Blackness into civil society. Malcolm X, especially when he was a part of the Nation of Islam, was like, nope, there's no possible way for us to have any relationship with white people. He was an advocate for segregation. He was an advocate for having no relationship with white people, for attempting to enfold ourselves into some society. So they were basically two opposite sides of the same conversation, both of how do we address the position of Blackness in America, but MLK felt that there were political ways to do that. And there was a chance for us to not have to radically change or abolish America as we know it, but through steps in terms of policy, we would be able to give more social life to that of the Black community. So what does this look like in debate then? So in debate, we have the soft left in the middle of the road AFs. So in terms of middle of the road AFs, this is what it looks like when, like soft left and middle of the road AFs, this is what it looks like when a team could read a human rights, humanitarian advantage, when a team is going to read an argument and then say like it's going to have an impact against anti-Blackness. It could look like a team talking about environmental racism, but it's still attached to a policy advocacy that is not requiring some radical reorientation of the state. So to give a difference between two advocacy statements or plan texts, the left and middle of the road act is going to say, hey, we should create a, let's say we're talking about criminal justice reform, right? Left and middle of the road is going to have a plan text that says the United States federal government should enact this law or bill that is going to require police officers to consistently have their body cameras on, and if they don't, then they will face like prosecution and legal action. So that would be a middle of the road act, or a soft left act that is then going to go on and say, we're doing this either because of anti-Black theory that makes it so police officers target Black people at a higher rate, and the only way to call them out is to be able to have video identification of what actually happened. Or they may go on to say that, you know, office like anti-Blackness, or because of anti-Blackness, then in the way that it structures different communities, they're policed more. So if we force officers to turn on their cameras, then it's going to allow for us to combat racism, right? So either they're going to use, like in terms of middle of the road act, they're going to use the structural framing of anti-Blackness to explain why they need to do their plan. For the soft left act, they're going to use their plan to explain why it would be an advantage for Black people. Now, a different advocacy statement that would not be Afro-optimism, but is still a plan text, would be the United States federal government should give the land back to indigenous communities of America, right? Because we clearly, like there's violence based on criminalization of these communities, violence that we see on the reservations, there's bad relationships between officers and people who live on reservations. And that would be a affirmative that is calling for a claim or defense that we could not conceptually see being on the floor of Congress. So if you are calling for something that is deemed radical, something that is not acceptable in terms of current politics, then that would not fit into the category of Afro-optimism. But if you are trying to use politics to create a change of onto anti-Blackness, then that would categorize itself as Afro-optimism. Now, there's always exceptions to all of these theories and ideologies. And while someone may say, hey, we need to advocate for this policy, they can also recognize that policies can possibly be contingent. And it is true that we do need contingent forms to protect ourselves from violence, but that's not to say that, you know, that's not to homogenize everyone and say that just because you read a plan text that says we should do this, that you are categorized as an Afro-optimist. You can still hold your beliefs of whatever positionality of Blackness that you have, but then still recognize that there needs to be some forms of contingent policies to be engaged in. But anyway, that's kind of a tangent. So back to the general theory, when we look at Afro-optimism, we can kind of conceptualize this in terms of authors such as J.T. Warren and The Faces of Whiteness, Pitfalls in the Critical Democratic. So in this article, he focuses on how we can critically think about the ways that we engage in policies, and he attempts to call out whiteness, but then also says there's a chance for us to create coalitions and reorient our thinking in terms of politics to become a more ethical democratic and ethical liberal. And often we'll see this deployed on the framework side of the debate, where this would be ideas such as the state as being heuristic, the argument of at least it's a step in the right direction, when people list off court cases and laws such as the Civil Rights Act or Brown versus Board of Education. Those would be times when we would say in framework that you are having an Afro-optimistic approach to the conversation of anti-Blackness. But at the end of the day, in debate, unfortunately, we don't refer to these terms as Afro-optimism. But I also want to put in a quick disclaimer. If you choose to research Afro-optimism, you're going to have better luck finding literature based on politics and race, looking up an argument that you're interested in, and then investigating how that type of, bill, policy, action impacts Black and Brown communities, and then using that to frame your advantage for using politics to address the suffering of the Black community. If you simply search up Afro-optimism, you are most likely going to come across Jared Sexton's analysis of Black optimism, which is very different because that's also founded in the theory of Afro-pessimism, but it just speaks to the ability for Black people to still assert some type of subjectivity outside of political subjectivity in terms of their own communities with engaging in culture and music, traditions, things like that. But that being said, we're going to use that as a segue into our next theory of Afro-pessimism. But before I do that, I would like everyone again to pause the video and take a second to discuss different concepts of Afro-optimism, like ways that this has manifested. Think about laws and bills, current politics, things that, you see in your everyday life that you realize, oh, this would fall into the category of Afro-optimism. Think about conversations that are currently happening around the nation, such as abolishing the police versus reforming the police, and just try to, break down some of the material things that you see to help you relate to the topic of Afro-optimism better. So I'll let you pause and then we'll continue on. All right, so now let's talk about theories of anti-Blackness in the context of Afro-pessimism. So to begin, I'm going to give the definition of Afro-pessimism based on the Oxford bibliography. And this definition was written by a multitude of very intelligent authors who are known for their theories revolving around Afro-pessimism. And this entry was established in 2018. So to begin, Afro-pessimism is a lens of interpretation that accounts for civil society's dependence on anti-Black violence, a regime of violence that positions Black people as internal enemies of civil society and cannot be analogized with the regimes of violence that disciplines the Marxist subaltern and post-colonial subaltern, the colored but non-Black Western immigrant, the non-Black queer, or the non-Black woman. So what this quote means to say is that Afro-pessimism is the belief that violence against anti-Blackness is required to give coherency to sovereign nation states. Anti-Blackness is not just intrinsic to, but it is vital and most importantly necessary for civil society to exist. So for this parasitic relationship to be true, anti-Blackness must be ontological, which Afro-pessimism would identify as being due to the Middle Passage. Because of the birthing of the chattel Black into this paradoxical position that is not recognized as human, it established this dominance of human, which means to establish this dominance of human, or this idea of human, which means the master aka the white male, it is impossible to remove Blackness from this paradoxical position without destroying the concept of the master or the human, and thus destroying the concept of what it means to be white in itself, as well as destroying the entirety of the world that is based on sovereignty. So this would remove the recognition of states. This would change the entire value system that is used to give coherency to structural oppression, or not structural oppression, but to overarching structures that are recognized as legitimate and valuable. Because to refer back to, and we can refer back to our conversation earlier of changes during the Enlightenment era and the process of exploration and the establishment of Blackness, to establish the new world, colonizers and masters relied on establishing what is not to create what is. To identify what is human, we must identify what cannot be human, which is why Black slaves were referred to as chattel slaves, not indentured servants, because if the slave is human and the master inflicts violence onto a human, then it questions the humanity of the master himself, because that would be inhumane, right? You know, that was a lot of humans thrown into that sentence, but basically the master needs to give themselves subjectivity, the ability to inflict violence onto others. So to do so, the slave cannot be recognized as another human being, because then they are inflicting violence onto their own subject formation. So this is why Black people were treated like animals. It was called chattel slavery, which refers to like herds on farms. There was branding and whipping. All of these mechanics of anti-Blackness that were on the plantation and violence on the plantation were purposeful to help delineate between the slave as the fungible object and the master as the valuable object. And being fungible, of having no value at all, being able to be killed, thrown away, face violence, and it have no effect, no change or impact in the world, gave coherency to what cannot be thrown away, to what cannot be fungible. So this is why for Indigenous folks to have genocide removed from the land, this can also explain for Indigenous folks, when they face genocide or removed from the land, it was to establish a space that could be conquered. So they had to genocide those that were occupying the land. They had to remove them from the land to then claim that this space is now occupied space, which is one of the ways that the mechanics of anti-Blackness also work in context of, like, also can be transported into some of the mechanics of settler colonialism. So to give coherency to something, they had to establish what is not. So by killing Indigenous folk and taking the land, they were saying this is not your land, to now claim that this is my land. To destroy the Black body, devalue the Black body, look at the Black body as an animal, to say you are not human, therefore I am human. Now, the libidinal economy becomes this new market of value. And that is what was established when it created Blackness as a fungible object and white as the valuable object. And we'll dive more into the libidinal economy later as we get into conversations about Frank Wilderson. Okay, to continue on. So let's talk about one of the first foundational authors of Afro-pessimism, Frantz Fanon. So Fanon, not the best with pronunciation, but anyway, Fanon uses this theory of psychoanalysis to simultaneously critique psychoanalysis, but then also give context to the foundations of anti-Blackness and frame the Black experience through psychoanalysis. This use of psychoanalysis, which has been used throughout centuries to understand human desires and how these desires translate into actions, helps to bring clarity to the disconnect between the violence inflicted on the Black flesh, along with the desire to conquer and the need for Blackness in society. So first, we can break down what is psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis is the philosophy or view that there are raw desires that shape our actions. And there's kind of this consistent internal battle where we have the id, the ego, and the superego. The id is these bare, raw, instinctual desires that are often underlined by sexual desires that we would inflict or enact into the world. So if we did not have any morals at all, how we as humans or people or beings would behave. Now, the superego is the opposite. It is the moral high ground. It is doing everything based on what is morally correct. And it's the part that is developed based on your based on your subjectivity, based on the cultural nature and nurture environment that you're in. Some of it can be based on instinctual thoughts or a shared consciousness of what we view as right, which Fanon would call this like the collective consciousness. But then it also can be evolved based on the culture that you live in. And now the ego is this tug of war between the two. The ego is the reality. It is how you balance your raw desires with your moralities, right? So that is why there's sometimes can be like tension, or we feel tension between what we want to do but what we know we have to do, because our super egos tells you like this is morally correct, but the id tells you this is what I want. And then we as the ego have to make a choice on how will we balance those two opposing pieces of our identity or psychic. So this explains how people, including nations, act. Psychoanalysis believes that at the raw core of the person, there are instinctual desires, but then we are trying to balance those desires with our moral high ground. Now, originally, psychoanalysis asserted that childhood trauma shaped experiences, and childhood trauma and experiences is what shaped phobias. However, Fanon asserts that colonization and slavery is actually what shapes desires and phobias for people that live in a colonized environment. So for an infant to be born into a colonial environment, it causes you to be subjected to a culture of racialized violence and oppression. Through this introduction, phobias are shaped for those who are colonized, but also for the colonizers. One example that Fanon uses to help conceptualize his argument is how a Black person could have a fear of being lynched without ever actually witnessing a lynching or having a close, intimate relationship with a lynching themselves. This framing of phobias through colonial violence is used to explain his concepts of the neurosis of Blackness. Now, neurosis is this mental and emotional disorder that can cause extreme anxiety and shape an individual's personality and actions. Neurosis stems from this disconnect between your id and your reality. A desire, a raw desire that you have, but the requirement or the superior ego that is the reality that you have to display. For example, we can talk about neurosis in terms of obsessive compulsive disorder. This desire to have a certain habit, certain perfection, and however that manifests for each unique individual, obsessive compulsive disorder has this underlying desire for a specific thing to be done in a specific way. Yet the reality that it needs to be suppressed at times. And when it has to be suppressed in terms of public engagement or in terms of being out in the open, where you're not able to control other people's actions, or you recognize that it makes you look crazy or like controlling if you display your raw desire. Not to say that that's any way that people should be identified or categorized, but recognizing the reality of how our world operates. When you are forced to deal with that reality, to confront that reality and to navigate it, then it can like manifest stress and anxiety. The inability to assert your desire for a specific action to be done now creates personalized stress and anxiety, which would be an example of neurosis. So that being said, the neurosis of Blackness is how the conflict between Black individuals having this desire to become white, to escape these phobias, which are shaped by anti-Black violence, yet the reality that this desire is impossible. And when I say the desire to become white, Fanon is very careful to delineate, it's not necessarily mean that you just want to have white flesh, but that we label our morals, which shapes our super ego in terms of whiteness. So what it means to be, a good citizen, what it means to be someone who is capable of having control, someone who is not barbaric, someone who's not the savage. All of these ideas of a civilized, moral, ethical person are founded in white theories, white ideologies, white practices, white culture. So wanting to become the most moral, ethical person you can be means that you would have to become white. And there's the inability for Black people to be shed of their Blackness. And Fanon addresses this when he engages in a chapter in Black Skin, White Mask called Look, a Negro. And it was this time where he was sitting and these children ran by him and showed this phobia of him and said, look, a Negro. And that realization of no matter how hard he attempts to be the most moral, outstanding citizen, he will always be coded by his Blackness. That is what shapes that reality, that experience is what shapes the neurosis of Blackness. Now, another key aspect of psychoanalysis is the claim that raw instincts are underlined by sexual desire. Fanon uses this understanding of sexual anxiety that white people have for Blackness to explain a couple levels of the relationship between the ways that anti-Blackness positions Black flesh in society. First, since Blackness is reduced to the space of the negative and the evil, it becomes culpable for all inferiorities, which pulls on that conversation that we just had about, morality is the superego being shaped in the context of whiteness. So if Blackness is evil, if Blackness is the culpable of impurities, then this means Blackness also represents all sexual perversions. So this can be seen, for example, in the film of Birth of a Nation, where there's this Black man and he's chasing a white woman and attempts to rape her. And she ends up jumping off a cliff and killing herself rather than being subjected to being raped by this man. This scene pictures the sexual anxiety that whites have of Blackness by making it appear that this Black man has this animalistic, uncontrollable, savage sexual desire for whiteness, while also painting the white woman as so pure that she would rather face death than to have relations with a Black man, because that would ruin her morality, that would destroy her superego. That being said, the Black is barbaric, aggressive, and uncontrolled, which allows for whites to not feel anxiety over their own sexual urges, since they are classified as the controlled urges. So it again gives coherency. These contradictory sides give coherency to one another. Furthermore, Fanon discusses the sexual jealousy that whites, especially white men, have of Blackness. And the sexual jealousy stems from sexual anxieties that white people have about themselves. The sexual jealousy, Fanon says, is expressed in castration during lynchings. We can also think about this in the context of Saartjie Baartman, who was a Khoi woman, or from the Khoi tribe in South Africa. And during the period of exploration, she was captured and taken back to Europe as a slave. And she was locked in a cage, and people consistently poked and prodded her to look at her grotesque features they described her as. So they examined like her butt and breasts, which they viewed as excessive, overly large, wasteful, and disgusting. But at the same time, there was like this weird desire to come see her. People are paying money to come and voyeurize her body. So there was this sexual desire to give coherency, to basically ease the own person's personal insecurities by devaluing her own sexuality. And in doing this, over time, she eventually passed away as she was locked up in this cage. And after she passed away, rather than, burying her body or properly disposing of her, Frantz dissected her reproductive organs. They literally cut her vagina out of her body and put it into a jar to be exploited and viewed in a museum for years to come. And it wasn't until the early 2000s that her remains were finally given back to South Africa for a proper burial. So that again is the example of how not only do these raw desires shape the actions, but it's that need for this sexual jealousy and this sexual desire for Black flesh is used to give coherency to a controlled white sexuality, but also to ease the anxieties that they have of their own personal identities by describing the other as disgusting and excessive. So in terms of literature that I think would be great to engage if you are more interested in this theory of psychoanalysis, Black Skin, White Masks, also The Wretched of the Earth are two great books by Fanon that can definitely help digest some of that heavy literature. But then also David Marriott. Wilderson actually makes a statement that David Marriott is a better Fanonian than Fanon himself, and analyzes him to a more contextualized understanding of current anti-Blackness. But anyway, that's something for everyone to investigate and decide on their own theory. So let's again take a second, pause here, and discuss psychoanalysis. Think of, like, I want to challenge everyone to think of the id, ego, and superego in a everyday context. So think of a situation where you have this raw desire. Think of the morals that prevent you from acting on that raw desire, and then explain what you would do instead. To give an example real quick, I would say, let's say I'm really thirsty and my friend is drinking water. My id is going to say, hey, instinctually, dude, you're thirsty, grab their cup of water and chug it, right? That would be, based on the superior ego, rude. So I can't just reach across and take my friend's cup of water and drink it myself. So how, in terms of my ego, am I going to navigate those two? My super ego would say, don't do anything. Like, it's morally wrong to take from somebody else. My id would say, dude, instinctually, I'm thirsty. So I may decide, hey, can I get a glass of water myself? Is it okay if, I pour some, like, take a sip of your water? I might try to find different ways to navigate that conversation. So take a second and think through how that, relates to your own life or different theories to help us conceptualize what is psychoanalysis, these different aspects of the psyche. All right, go ahead. Okay, so I hope everyone had a chance to pause, and we are going to continue on. So now we are going to talk about Afro-pessimism in the context of, oh, sorry, y'all. I did not mean to check this out. Okay. Okay, let's talk about Saidiya Hartman. So Saidiya Hartman, the literature she has, the literature she's produced, Saidiya Hartman has been classified as an Afro-pessimist, but her analysis of the position of Blackness provides understanding to both Black feminism as well as gendered politics. At times during some interviews, she refers to other authors of Afro-pessimists, seemingly to do it outside of herself. But at the end of the day, her literature is used as a huge foundation for Afro-pessimist theorists. But this but it's not to disavow, her own assertion of what her work is, and that she has a complex and multitude engagement in terms of Black identity. In her first book, Scenes of Subjection is what we'll talk about first. But in her first book, Hartman dives into multiple narratives of different individuals that lived during the transatlantic slave trade and post-emancipation to illuminate the interworkings of anti-Blackness. So what Hartman does is she gives the warrants for Blackness as ontological by looking at individualized narratives. So one of the key framings or ways that Hartman does this narrativization of the Middle Passage is by focusing on the archive. So one of Hartman's main prerogatives is to address the effects of the archive on twisting history and disposing of Black life in exchange for white subjectivity. The archive can be identified as all forms of provided verifiable knowledge. This includes libraries, artifacts, preserved literature from history, museums, anything that we can use to verify existence and knowledge. The archive works to not only whitewash history, but erase Black existence to maintain civil society. So we can see this in narratives of Black life, such as Emmett Till. Often when we discuss Emmett Till, we discuss the violence that he faced. We discuss the dehumanization of his body, his identity, the torture and gratuitous violence that he faced. But we do not sit here and narrate his life. We don't sit here and talk about, the things he loved doing as a child, the friends that he had, how he engaged in school, the different sports that he played, the activities he liked to do. We simply erase the existence of the Black life in exchange for the violence that was inflicted by, anti-Blackness or by whiteness. So by working to continue to detach these lived experiences from the violence inflicted on the flesh, the archive is able to eradicate Blackness to the position of the unthought, because it's not something that is ever narrated, ever thought of. So Hartman works to narrate Black life, to narrate the position of the unthought. And she calls this the idea of like familiarizing or unfamiliarizing the familiar, which she does this in multiple levels. One is she focuses on like quotidian forms of violence and how that makes the flesh. So Hartman used these narratives to analyze quotidian forms of violence that turns Africans into Black flesh. By discussing the everyday life of Black individuals throughout different areas, she focuses on how violence shaped Black life. In The Hold of the Slave Ship, she discussed the grotesque conditions in which Black people were held, the infections, the fluids that Black people were forced to live in, the death that surrounded them on the plantation. She discussed how the Black body was treated as being void of humanity, and it was just working flesh, that the Black body no longer had the identity of human, but just as literally a chunk of flesh that is able to perform for the state productivity. So this violence that was inflicted, both symbolic and physical, that was inflicted onto the Black body is what allowed, again, through that transformation or detachment of humanism, for Blackness to be turned into Black flesh. These everyday forms of violence is what shapes our conversations about consent, which is one of the next key takeaways from a lot of Hartman's literature. So both in terms of asserting one's will and one's sexual agency, Hartman calls into question, like, how can a slave consent? And before we dive into this topic, this is another point where I would like y'all to pause and take a moment to think about this question. Can a slave have consensual intimacy with their master? Or better yet, is it possible for the slave to love their master of their own free will? Think about the positionality of Blackness. Think about some of the theories that we talked about. Think about Fanon in context of sexual desire and the ability to assert like sexual agency, and the ability to assert sexual agency in terms of, or the ways that sexual jealousy and sexual desires like underline the power relations and value systems between Black and white. But yeah, really like take a second and question, is a slave able to consent? Okay, I hope you had a chance to pause, but what Hartman argues is that the slave must lose the entire ability to consent to create the establishment of white willpower. So again, it's this contextualizing one thing in opposition to the other, where for there to be the ability to consent, there also must be the ability to not consent. And for this ability to not consent is what creates the subjectivity or the ability to assert will for white people. So one example that she uses to give this is the court case, the state of Missouri versus Cecilia in 1855, where Cecilia was a slave who was consistently being raped by her master. And one day, in an act of resistance, she asserted her consent. She asserted her subjectivity by killing her master. However, when it went to court, Cecilia is the one facing a crime because since she was property, since she was fungible, she does not have the ability to consent to touch of her body. So she was viewed as a criminal, which gives us another question about the paradox, right? How, if you do not have the ability to consent, to act agency, are you able to make a choice to do that inflicts harm? So that is, again, the position of where Blackness, right, can only be productive in terms of the state. So when Black people do something that is not productive for the state, then it is criminalized, right? You are targeted. And Blackness is always facing criminality. But when you do something that is underproductive, then you are choosing to act in opposition to the state. That's the only time that it seems that Black people can assert subjectivity, right? Or assert their willpower, is in a negative, a contradictory way. Yet, in a positive way, for yourself, for you to do something, for you to exist, you have no ability to assert consent or subjectivity. Now, we can jump into another concept that Hartman talks about, such as empathy. Hartman also questions the idea of empathy and asserts that it is impossible for the human to feel empathy towards a slave while also allowing Blackness to exist in that position. So to clarify, she talks through a narrative in Scenes of Subjection about an abolitionist, where this man makes these pleas in opposition to slavery by placing himself and his family in the context of being a slave. To do so, for him to have empathy towards the position of the slave, the human must insert themselves into the picture and remove the Black person, the Black identity, to be able to empathize with the violence, which means it's not the Blackness that they are building the relationship with, but rather the person, their own personal morality, their own subjectivity, and their own proximity to violence that allows them to feel this false empathy. Also, empathy makes the assumption that the mechanics of anti-Blackness are not purposeful, which, if we recall throughout our conversation, they are very purposeful to help distinguish what is human versus what is not human, to help break the mind but keep the body to be productive for the state, and also to give coherency to the master's ability to assert their own subjectivity. So empathy cannot exist because these are purposeful actions taken, thoughtful actions taken to create a system of value and exchange that puts white at the top. So this is why she says, for there to be reparations at all, then we must have a revolution to occur. It's impossible for us to address all the grievances of anti-Blackness because the violence is accumulates over time. It's intergenerational. That can pull on the conversation where we talked about when the slaves had children, those slaves are born into servitude. But then also in the current context of how Black people, we carry the weight of our ancestors on our shoulders. Every day we have to think about the atrocities that happened throughout our past, but also endure the atrocities that are happening to us today. So the only way for that reparation to ever be possible is to completely shift the world order to make sure it redresses all of the grievances of the past and the present, which means it would have to be a revolution because it would call for a taking of power, taking of sovereignty from the human, the white subject location. Okay, so there are several books here that I dropped in. Scenes of Subjection, To Lose Your Mother, Venus in Two Acts, Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments, and The Position of the Unthought, which is a conversation between Hartman and Wilderson, which gives a lot of analysis to the intricacies of Scenes of Subjection, but then also is used by Wilderson to begin to theorize some of his foundational philosophies, which we will now jump into next. So Frank Wilderson, right? He is known for more so focusing on the forest rather than the trees. Well, Hartman uses the trees to illuminate the context of Afro-pessimism and the positionality of Blackness. Wilderson more so does the opposite, where he talks about the ways that anti-Blackness shapes subject location and different identities, but he still does analyze and narrate like individualized realities. So Wilderson pulls on his education in the cinema to help provide a lot of context for ways that Blackness is presented in terms of movies and multimedia. And then he also pulls on his personal experience of living in South Africa and also being a Black man in the United States to explain his theories of anti-Blackness. Now, to begin, one of the things that Wilderson is really recognized for is his analysis of social death, which he derived his framing from Orlando Patterson. And social death is made up of three categories. First, being generally dishonored. Generally dishonored you can think of that in terms of dehumanization, devaluing, this constant degrading of your person, of who you are as a being, right? So generally dishonored came into positions such as like the conditions in which slaves lived in the slavehold and also on the plantation. It generally, like being generally dishonored came into not being able to assert your own subjectivity as an individual. Generally dishonored came into being forced to dance when you didn't want to versus not being able to express your culture in other times. Now, another aspect of the social death is gratuitous violence. Where gratuitous violence is violence just for the sake of violence. It's not warranted, it's not necessary. And what makes, these mechanics gratuitous violence in terms of the plantation, such as the whippings and the torturings of slaves, is we can think about the relationship between chattel slavery and like Irish slavery or Roman slavery, where neither one of these two latter terms or periods of slavery required lynchings, tortures, and such intense forms of violence to control the population or the community, which means that the violence inflicted on the slave was gratuitous. It was so violent, it eradicated the personhood out of existence. It eradicated the subjectivity out of existence, right? Lastly, we can think of kinship. So social death also means that that community is void of kinship, as in they have been severed, natally alienated, severed from their ties to their original countries, cultures, and communities, but then also they continue to have their homelands and communities disrupted and broken apart. So that looks like on the plantation, the breaking apart of men and women and their children. It looks like the inability to be married. It looks like the inability to speak in your native tongue to represent your culture. But then all three of these also can be presented very strongly in the context of the raping of the slaves, right? Where at times slaves would be raped in front of their significant other for the point of generally dishonoring the individual, to disrespect the kinship that they seem to have built between them, but then also was an act of gratuitous violence because there was no reason to perform the raping of the slave. Okay, so now to continue on, Wilderson also draws from Fanon and Hartman to explain the libidinal economy, which this is the exchange of desires underlining the sexuality, fears, assertions, enjoyments that shape value. It's this new market that was solidified via the Middle Passage. And the libidinal economy has this like constant desire for Black flesh, but then also this gratuitous violence, this need to eradicate Blackness from existence. So that exchange between them and what gives coherency to whiteness could be articulated as this libidinal economy. Now, Wilderson also makes the assertion that for the libidinal economy to exist, it must consistently be reaffirmed through violence of like anti-Blackness. It must continuously have violence inflicted on the Black subject because there's constantly a shifting in terms of the current structures of the world. So to give coherency to changes that are continuously happening, then there must be a reaffirmation of violence, which is why we can never pull Blackness out of this paradoxical position, because it must always be facing violence, undergoing new forms of violence to give coherency to these new structures, these new subject locations, and to continue to allow white superiority. So different books by Wilderson to engage in are Whites Are Seniors. Sorry, that's a whole other stuff. So different books by Wilderson to engage in are the Red, White, and Black book, which gives a great cinematic understanding of structural anti-Blackness and uses movies and multimedia to depict that. We can also look at, again, the position of the unthought, which is a wonderful conversation between Hartman and Wilderson. Also, Incognegro is another great book that we can use by Wilderson to understand this structural positionality, along with more works and essays that he has created. But I realize I dropped off a point here. One of the last founding things that, or one of the last points we'll talk about with Wilderson is the concept that whites are seniors, Blacks are slaves, and non-Blacks exist as junior partners. But he makes distinctions to the positionality of natives of people who are indigenous and native to America. So this can give us a chance to conceptualize how other identities relate to Blackness. Okay, so we're going to continue on, but we'll talk about, let's talk about Spillers first, and then everyone can pause again and think about Afro-pessimism as a whole. So I want to put out a disclaimer is, well, Spillers is foundational for the understanding of anti-Blackness or Afro-pessimism and the structural position of anti-Blackness. She does a lot of her analysis through like a Black feminist lens, where she focuses on the positionality of the Black woman in the context of the plantation to understand the ways that the intricacies and mechanisms of anti-Blackness. So there's three general questions that Spillers asks that we're going to quick address. First, Spillers gives us the question of gender, and she is famous and recognized for this idea that the slave is ungendered. So what she talks about is how the process of violence that is inflicted on the plantation, this intersection between the lash and the rape, right, makes it so that way there's the inability for there to be intimacy between like the master and the slave or the Black woman. But also it puts the Black woman into the position that is traditional, that in the nuclear family or white nuclear family is traditionally held as the position for the man. So when a Black woman has a child, such as Sally Hemings has Thomas Jefferson's children, those children inherit the position of the Black woman, rather than the position of the Black man. It turns a slave into a feminized position, a position of docile domestication, right? So the slave is ungendered because it loses the ability to assert subjectivity in terms of what gender is traditionally conceptualized as. We can also look at it in the context of the raping that happened by both men, that happened to both men and women on the plantation, but then also the burden to work by both men and women on the plantation. Pregnant Black women did not get the freedom to stop working, right? So even when you are about to have a child, it was up to you. You still had the obligation to go out into the field or to be in the house doing your everyday work. It ungendered the slave because it, especially in the context of taking away this disconnect between the woman and maternity. So, well, one of the things that I just want to point out is Spillers does make like these, like, not exceptions, but a disclaimer to say that she does not want to like have her language of woman or what it means to be a woman to be misarticulated in terms of like the solidification of gender or what gender is, or to tie sexuality and gender to like biological features, but rather she recognizes gender in terms of its man-made construction and uses that analysis of the white concept of gender to explain how humanity and subject formation was void in terms of Black flesh and Black people on the plantation, which is why the slave is ungendered. Next, we're going to talk about the flesh versus the like body and the hieroglyphics of the flesh, which is a theory that Spillers also established. She talks about how, again, this intersection between the whip and the rape of the like slaves on the plantation is one of the things that transformed the body into the flesh, right? It removed that subjectivity, which we see Hartman also discussing the idea of removing subjectivity from the body to create the flesh. But she talks about these markers, these hieroglyphics of the flesh that are physically left, as the whip was, purposely created to like dig out sections of Black flesh. It leaves markings, the markings of the slave, the markings of Blackness. It engraves and tattoos them onto the body, which tells the story of the pain and the suffering. You can read it, you can read the suffering on the skin of the Black slave, which is the hieroglyphics of the flesh. Lastly, she also questions what it means to be a woman in terms of the nuclear family, and she compares like the white family in contrast to the slave. This also pulls back to the conversation we just had about gender, but it's also important because it helps us conceptualize or begin to, determine like what does this phrase or term woman actually mean. And clearly in the context, like she makes it very clear that in the context of the slave, the woman is woman or femininity becomes associated with the position of what it means to be a slave. But then it also gives coherency to the purity of the white woman, right? The one who does not have to do hard labor, the one that gets to take, rest and breaks and is pampered while she is pregnant, right? The one whose children have a father figure. Whereas in terms of the slave, especially the slave is raped by the master, the slave is unable to have a father figure on the plantation. They are shadow families, is what Spiller calls them. So she uses like this concept and understanding of gender to explain the positionality of the slave and how the erasing of gender, and especially the intersection of violence between being a woman and being Black on the plantation, creates and shapes what it means to be a slave. Okay, so let's take a quick break before we dive into Afrofuturism. Go ahead and pause it and talk about the differences between all three of these authors. That was a lot of information, like we kind of just digested, and I know at times I got a little, tripping over my words, but please take a second, pause it, and think about, what is Afro-pessimism and how do different authors conceptualize that theory? Okay, great. So now we are going to go ahead and jump into Afrofuturism. So Afrofuturism is this belief that Black subjectivity can exist in like alternative spaces, right? It incorporates like fantasy and art and science fiction and lived Black experiences and, you know, like even extraterrestrial, like all of these different otherworldly concepts to explain the possibilities that Blackness holds. It also can, you know, pull on Afro-pessimistic theory, but it doesn't always have to stem from Afro-pessimism. But a lot of times, some of the authors that we're about to talk about do follow beliefs of Afro-pessimism, but then use Afrofuturism as a mean of advocacy in the social context of like being a Black person who is socially dead. It's a way to, you know, deal with the reality of your existence. So one of the key things Afrofuturism does is it shifts the understanding of temporality. So in terms of the white hegemonic system, temporality is like this linear structure as time continuously moves forward. What Afrofuturism does is it disrupts that linear temporality. One is it, you know, already kind of makes the argument that Blackness does that disruption when we talk about like Hartman's accumulation of violence, when we talk about like intergenerational violence, when we talk about the possibility of reparations, which means that it has to, you know, give back what was taken from our ancestors. Blackness in of itself is that disruption of temporality. But Afrofuturism uses, you know, scenes from the past, scenes from the future, scenes from the present to create these alternate realities, alternate spaces in which Blackness is able to exist. It can talk about ways that Blackness asserts subject location on the plantation, right? A way that Afrofuturism may be manifested in terms of the past is by positioning the Black person in the position of the master. What would that mean, right? For the entirety of the world, the entirety of history, for Black people to be the master. That wouldn't change everything that we understand about race, concepts, and flip everything on its head, right? It would disrupt the entirety of the world as we know it. It would be an alternate reality, yeah? Another way that Afrofuturism can disrupt temporality is by thinking of dystopian futures, where it'll think of post-apocalyptic futures or futures that exist after the crumbling of a society. And it pulls on different cultural instincts to shape the ways that communities survive and are revolved around Black identity. So one great author who like does a great job of shaping or using like science fiction and dystopian theories to shape conversations about Blackness is Octavia Butler. Well, most of her books were published prior to the actual concept of Afrofuturism. She is recognized as an Afrofuturist in terms of the way that she deploys her theories, her knowledge, and her use of Black cultural survival skills to navigate like these dystopian futures. So Octavia Butler is someone great to read if you're interested in more of like a fantasy narrative science fiction type telling of the world. She uses like narrative. She uses a story, right? Which she literally is writing stories. She's writing chapter books. She's using these to make overall claims about the position of Black subjectivity and how that can be asserted in different science fiction realities. Another amazing author is Alexander Wahilier. So Wahili is a great author in terms of like speaking into the mechanisms of Afrofuturism. In fact, he has a book itself called Afrofuturism. But he talks a lot of like, he's known for this theory of habeas viscus, which means like the thickness of the flesh. And he talks about the ways that Blackness exists in alternate realities, where the reality is we live in this anti-Black world, we live in this Afro-pessimistic world, but through culture, through new forms of kinship, through relationship that we build with each other by recognizing a form of agency within within the Black community, within other Black people, we are able to create like these alternate realities in which we are able to like tune in to the flesh, tune into our, I don't want to use the term humanity, but tune into our ability to like assert a identity, to live, to enjoy, to laugh, right? So Wahili would be like give context to the idea of slaves dancing on the plantation, but still enjoying their dancing. So Wahili could also give context to when like Hartman's question of consent. How is consent a thing for the slave? Where Healy could talk about how even though the Black is in the position of the slave, there's still ways that they tune out of the reality that they exist to find personal enjoyment and pleasure within other relationships. Lastly, we can talk about a more contemporary, interesting possible way of examining Afrofuturism, and this would be Marvel's Watchmen, where in Watchmen, Marvel literally rewrites history in terms of what happened after the burning down of I forgot the term, but Black Wall Street. There we go. Sorry about that. But Marvel rewrites like what happened after the burning of Black Wall Street and how a relationship between police officers and the KKK and the Black community changed and shifted the, you know, I don't want to say like superiority, but the positionality, the subject location of Black people in the United States. It creates an entire different reality that is futuristic, scientific, super heroic, right? Where Black people exist in a different position than what they exist in today. And there's twists and turns all throughout it, but it helps us understand that Afrofuturism does not mean that we have to negate, you know, the structure of anti-Blackness. We have to negate violence. It doesn't mean that it's a utopian, perfect world, but rather it's the idea of putting Black experiences into different locations, into alternate locations. Okay. Now, next, we're going to talk about Black feminism. I know we're getting a little bit over time here, so I'm going to try my best to like keep it moving through this. But real quick, Black feminism, it just basically centers the conversation of anti-Blackness around Black women. It says that Black women were like integral to the creation of the nation state, that without the Black woman, we would not have the ability to give coherency to subjectivity, to the context of consent, to the context of the ability to assert your will, without the, you know, existence of Black women. So this is why like Spillers and Hartman will also be used often in Black feminist theory, because they do analyze the position of Blackness through the lens of Black women on the plantation. Also, we can think about European exploration, and some theories, right, or some analysis of Black feminism talk about what made these, like what allowed for the slave to be damned as the savage, right? So when European exploration first happened, then, and there was like the first times that like Europeans were engaging with indigenous Africans, there are often writings from the European explorers where they're talking about these women who had their breasts out, who were dancing, who were loud, who were dominating, who were masculine. And that categorization of the woman as being opposite to that of their pure white woman was used to help solidify the Black as being a savage, because the women had savage tendencies. And that helped to select the Black population for slavery. It also questions like what a Black society would look like. So if we, you know, created this whole like utopian world, or not utopian world, but this segregated world where Black exists on its own outside of the context of whiteness, would that stop things like domestic violence within Black communities? Would that stop things such as the breaking of families? Would that stop things such as violence also in terms of like Black men murdering Black trans women? So by centering the question of what it means to be a Black woman and looking through a Black feminist lens to analyze anti-Blackness, it helps to give coherency or paint some of those intricate questions about anti-Blackness and its intersection like with patriarchy and gender, and also sexuality. There are different topics that Black feminism can, you know, divulge into. There's all these different tangents that Black feminism can go through. One example is how Black feminism can be used to explain like the domestic life of a Black household. It can be used to explain how within the household, the Black woman has this overburden to protect her children that in a white household, in gender construction, the mom or mother would not have, the feminine would not have. And again, this is based on white constructions of gender, not which like gender is a false concept. Not to say that sexuality is tied, or sex, like gender is tied at all to a certain biological sexual position or sex, like biological sex. It's totally constructive. But anyway, The white mother does not have this need to consistently worry about her child living from day to day. White people are able to sit back and be like, oh, I want to think about making like a savings fund for my kid. Whereas in the Black house, the mother has to think, oh, when is an appropriate time for me to have a conversation with my children about how they approach police so I don't get that call that they were killed, right? The mother has to take on this burden of the protector as well. That in terms of the nuclear gendered white family would be the role designated to just the father. So in terms of a Black household, the lines are blurred in between, like the lines are blurred in terms of their domestic life. So the mother has not only the burden of like birthing the children, but then also securing their like livelihood and living experience alongside with the father also securing like their livelihood and lived experience. But that extra weight, that extra burden that is not obligated to the white woman is what creates a shift in terms of Black domestic households. Another tangent of Black feminism can be the structural position of Black women, where they are culpable for all the conditions of the world, right? So an example that we can give about this is the idea that in terms of the Black woman, there are so many different categories or labels that are used to identify the type of Black woman, right? There's the welfare queen, there's the baby mama, there is a Black woman who is ghetto, there's a loud, angry Black woman. And we use all of these like different classifications of what it means to be a Black woman to explain different structures. For example, when we think about the welfare queen, right? The idea that we cannot have a universal type of healthcare coverage and support for people in poverty is because there are those who are welfare queens who take advantage, overproduce children, underproduce for the state, and basically sit at home all day and use up all our taxes for their own like pleasure. There's this idea of like drugs behind it, like drug abuse behind it, between like being wasteful behind it. And the idea of the welfare queen, it's a Black idea, right? Typically when we have these conversations, there's a blackening of the conversation. There's like a racialization in which this conversation is happening because we again negate Blackness with being the lowest of the low. So it is a Black woman who is the welfare queen, right? And she is the one who is making it so that way, like we can't have all of these universal systems of support for people in poverty because she is wasteful. And that being said, the name of the welfare queen now makes the Black woman culpable for the entirety of capitalistic problems that we face in America and globally, right? So that's an example of how the position of the Black woman becomes culpable and how Black feminism gives like language and conversation to those theories, points out how there's a feminization of certain terms and ideologies. Also, we can talk about the stealing of Black female bodies as one of the last tangents. So a stealing of Black female bodies can be conceptualized in the ways that Black women do not have agency to consent in terms of their own will, and how their bodies are used against them to produce for the state outside of just the plantation. But a key example of this is Henrietta Lacks, where she had a piece of her flesh taken out from inside her cervix during a cancer examination. But that piece of flesh was the first time that cells in terms of science ever reproduced human cells ever reproduced outside of their host. So scientists then use those cells to create a multi-billion, if not trillion-dollar corporation to create vaccines, to test hair products and makeup products. In fact, the COVID-19 vaccines were tested on HeLa cells, but her family never received any type of payment, any type of reparation. So she literally had her flesh, her body stolen from her in a way that allowed for the production of, white futurity, the production of white survivability, but it did not provide any survivability. In fact, it damaged her family more it didn't provide any survivability and damaged her family more than it didn't do anything good for her family, right? So again, it's that antagonistic relationship, one person or parasitic relationship. One system profits off of the flesh of the Black woman. So authors that we can look at to examine Black feminism: Patricia Hill Collins is great, Audre Lorde is great, Bell Hooks is great, and we also have Hartman and Spillers, who are other great artists, are authors when it comes to the conversation of Black feminism. Okay, so let's take a second and again break down these two concepts of Afrofuturism and Afrofeminism that we had just talked about, and then we'll try to wrap up our conversation in terms of identities and their relationship to Blackness, what this looks like in debate, and then readdressing our objectives, and end with an activity I'd like us to do. Okay, so let's quickly address identities in the relation to Blackness. A lot of this pulls on from the conversations that we had earlier. So when we talk about indigeneity and settler colonialism, we can reach back to that conversation we had about Wilderson, where he talked about how the genocide of the land gave coherency to the conquering of the New World, to establishing the nation state as the white new colonies. So this clearing, this genocide of indigeneity and this process of settler colonialism, Wilderson has this theory that it created the position of the native as half human, which is that special, analysis that he provides when he's talking about junior partners in society, where the Native American is now half human, and how anti-redness and anti-Blackness worked in tandem to create this new world. And in the process of that, it genocided and dehumanized and created this natal alienation that indigenous people have with the land that they came from, right? They were forced to go to schools to unlearn their own culture and assimilate to white culture. And the fact that there still is some existence to what is the term Turtle Island, or the phrase Turtle Island is the term used by indigenous communities to identify the earth or the land that they occupy. Since there's still some existence on Turtle Island, it creates a half human, where they do have the potentiality to be enfolded into white society by assimilation. They were given this choice of completely eradicating the indigenous identity they had and taking on a white identity. Well, that again is violent in of itself. That is why Wilderson determines it as half human, because there is never the ability for Blackness to be enfolded into civil society. And it's not to say that, each analysis in of itself is better than another. But that's just in terms of settler colonialism, anti-Blackness, how Afro-pessimism kind of theorizes about settler colonialism in the context of indigenous natives to America. Also, Sylvia Wynter, in her huge monologue, Black Metamorphosis, which is over 900 pages long, you can read small dissertations or reviews about it. I don't know if you're able to find the entire work, since it is an unpublished book technically, but there are quite a few analyses and lectures on YouTube that talk about her writings. But anyway, in this book, Black Metamorphosis, Sylvia Wynter questions what it means to be indigenous and native in the context of anti-Blackness, but then also with other power relations. So she uses power relations between whites to give coherency or create the indigenous and native identity. So somebody who is having a power control or who is the subaltern in context of whiteness is relegated into the position of indigenous, because they have a new identity based on the land that they exist on. So Black people, chattel Black people, in her argument, is that when they were brought to America, they were birthed, an entire new race was birthed on this land, which makes Black people indigenous to America, because that existence, they did not exist anywhere prior, right? So she kind of connects indigeneity, settler colonialism to anti-Blackness to understand the commonalities between the position of the indigenous, but then also position of Black people in the wider context of civil society and these power struggles between Black, brown, and white people. So now we're going to quick talk about non-Black people of color. So this is where we talk about this proximity to Blackness that gives coherency to other identities. This value exchange where Blackness is the fungible and whiteness is the valuable allows for people who fall in between these categories of the Black and the white, the slave and the master, to exist as junior partners, or people who have the ability to still enact and inflict anti-Black violence or assert their subjectivity to an extent within civil society, but their proximity or shared culture and traditions with Blackness still make them experience a level of anti-Black violence. An example of this can be Palestine, where Palestine was viewed as a fungible area to eradicate Black and brown people from their land to make space for white Jewish folks. So that proximity to Blackness, that proximity to, being brown, to being otherized, is what allowed for, is like the framing that allowed for this violence to be used, which is why Palestine was picked versus other areas. And I recognize that Palestine has this there's this argument about the religious context, or the natural, or not natural, but these historical artifacts that exist in that area. But at the end of the day, it was still acceptable because they were not deemed as the human. They were not deemed as the white human, which is that question of morals, right? Even if it's this urge to give people a place near their religious artifacts, it morally is incorrect, but those morals don't apply because they have a proximity to Blackness. We can also think about Blackness in the context of the myth of the model minority, where the Blackness giving the slave the position of the lazy, the underproductive, the inability to do anything for society outside of what it was created to do, outside of being controlled or forced to do something, gives coherency to the myth of the model minority. It's like a double-sided coin, where the Asian immigrant is overworking, overproductive, has this ability to, project, to become so intelligent, to create all of these jumps for their family or for their community. The idea the model minority is perfect. The model minority or the Asian minority is going to be the most intelligent, right? It's given coherency because for that to exist, there has to be the minority that is the opposite of that. So these two stereotypes and forms of oppression play off of each other to separate the coalitions between what it means to be Black, and coalitions of Blackness and coalitions between Asians. So there becomes a disconnect because it pits these two identities and social locations against each other to allow for more support of whiteness. And now lastly, for white communities, when we think of class, gender, sexuality, there's a commonality or unity among whiteness. And Wilderson and Hartman all talk about this, where they recognize or address that even if you are in a position of poverty, even if you are in a position of being queer, even if you are in a position of not matching to the liberal norm of whiteness, you still share a commonality of being white. And that commonality is what allows for intensities of violence to be inflicted. It's not to say that people who are nobody who is white faces some type of oppression, but it's to say that because there's a shared unity of being white, it allows for violence to be multiplied or magnified, intensified onto different Black social locations when there's an intersection of multiple isms. So it gives coherency to what it means to be a white queer in contrast to what it means to be a Black queer, right? How there are so many murders of trans women that happen around the nation, but we often see this type of associated violence of overkill when it comes to the killing of Black trans women. A different type of violence, a violence that includes gratuitous violence, because it's not only the society wanting to eradicate their trans identity, but it's also them wanting to eradicate their Black flesh. That creates this, overarching overkill that Black trans women face. And again, this is not to make oppression Olympics in terms of who faces more oppression or what identity, has the harder lifestyle, but it's rather to analyze the intricacies and mechanisms between social networks. So in context of debate for non-Black individuals, let's talk about what do we do when we're debating about anti-Blackness. First of all, non-Black people can read anti-Blackness. That's totally okay. But the things that you want to think through as you are making an argument about anti-Blackness is first think through questions of co-option, voyeurism, and spectacles of violence. Make sure that you're purposeful about the language that you're using. You are not simply reading narratives of violence or creating spectacles out of the position of Blackness. that you are not voyeurizing or using the Black experience to give yourself this moral high ground, because in the end, that would contradict the entirety of the point of the argument. And it would end up projecting like anti-Blackness in a different way, like liberalized anti-Blackness, you could say. So when you read anti-Blackness, just be purposeful about the language and the argument that you are making. Also, focus on personal and structural strategies. Instead of like making strategies about this means we should support grassroots, like we should have like more grassroots movements, we should have like Black Lives Matter do something. That puts the culpability onto, again, the slave or the Black person to do the work of liberation. So focus on personal, I don't want to say like agency, but necessarily ways that individuals outside of a Black social location can target or announce whiteness and can target or announce anti-Blackness and help to use their privilege to break down those structures. Also, you'll want to make sure you find empirical examples of your argument. So if you're going to make a advocacy statement about a way that you should personally engage in structures to break down anti-Blackness, find histories that support that don't end up in co-option. So example, if we sit here and say, hey, we should advocate for a bill such as a body cam law that forces you again to have your body cams turned on, we would want to look at, okay, well, the first law of body cams like didn't go as planned because there's always this loophole. So think through the empirics of your example and your argument, so that way you are fully considering the intricacies of anti-Blackness and the intricacies of like violence that is the intricacies of violence that like gives coherency to these politics. So if you are recognizing like, hey, this is just like a political step or a political policy, be willing to say like, this is the contingent form of reform that allows for us to create some level of protection while larger works are in the make. It's okay to recognize it as contingent because we can't solve for the entirety of anti-Blackness. But don't put yourself in the position of attempting to solve for the entirety of anti-Blackness, because that's when things can get a little tricky. Now, when you're debating against anti-Blackness, on the other side of it, one, use like the idea that structures work in tandem to your advantage. So anti-Blackness already takes into account Marxism, already takes into account psychoanalysis. So reading those theories alone against anti-Blackness aren't always going to fully address racialized violence, especially because anti-Blackness says like capitalism is racialized capitalism and points out that's the flaw in Marxist theory, because there's this exchange of values, not just this exchange of material economic, like of material coins or money, right? So make sure you focus on like, you know, how structures work in tandem. So how anti-Blackness will work with settler colonialism to explain the position of clearing the land. If you want to go for a conversation about indigeneity, then you might want to think about like looking into the conversation of the metaphysics, like the Black metamorphosis that Sylvia Wynter talks about, to help give coherency as to why it's important to also engage in this aspect of the conversation. Otherwise, we cannot fully address the like consequences and the positionality of Blackness or of anti-Blackness. Also, always make sure you have like a coherent explanation as to how your alternative, your other argument, your oppositional side frames the position of Blackness in society. Because if somebody gets up and says like, hey, Blackness is ontological, and you're like, hey, let's change this politic, they're gonna be like, you kind of miss like the first chunk of this argument. So you want to make sure that you fully understand like, how does my argument explain what it means to be a Black person in the United States, and how does these structural antagonisms shape or play a role or interact with my alternative. And last, like try to avoid the oppression Olympics, because often when we are debating about anti-Blackness, it can become easy to be like, well, hey, classism is a problem and it's universal, so we need to address that first. And it becomes this oppression Olympics of what matters more, rather than recognizing commonalities and shared experience and how anti-Blackness can create, can articulate other forms of oppression. By using, you know, that tandem argument, then it avoids like the idea of, oh, we just need to focus on like this identity because they're more oppressed or they face oppression too, but allows for you to address how the affirmative is unable to solve because of these intersections of violence. Okay, So feel free to pause here. We've talked about a lot, and our lecture went quite a bit over time, but let's summarize the objectives that we talked about. Take a second and go through like, what is anti-Blackness? What are the 4 theories that we covered? What are some of the different authors who talk about them? And then how does anti-Blackness work with other isms and shape other identities? Okay, so just a quick over our objectives. I'm sure like y'all did a great job of talking about them among yourselves. First, we address what anti-Blackness is, and we recognize as its structural antagonism against Black flesh and culture and communities and identity. It's this like parasitic relationship that Black people have to the like that civil society has to Black people, right? So it targets more than just Black people based on their skin color, but it allows for like this proximity to Blackness because it also targets cultures, religions, communities, land, identity, all of these aspects that shape someone's ontology or being, right? It targets all of these aspects, which then allows for other identities that have like this proximity to be of Blackness to also face forms of anti-Blackness. Now, the 4 theories we talked about Afro-optimism, and we talked about that as like Malcolm X in context of MLK, where MLK is like, we can enfold ourselves into civil society. Malcolm X is like, no, we can't do that. So Afro-optimism is the idea that we can incorporate Black people into civil society without having a radical redress of the world as we know it. Then we talked about Afro-pessimism. We talked about Fanon with psychoanalysis, Hartman with the context of like consent and theories of empathy. We talked about Wilderson with his libidinal economy and his like paradigmatic analysis of the world. And then we also talked about Spillers with like hieroglyphics of the flesh and the slave being ungendered, and how all of these subcategories of Afro-pessimism, these different variations that these authors have on the idea of Afro-pessimism, shape the way that anti-Black violence operates. Lastly, we talk about Afrofuturism. Well, not lastly, but next we talk about Afrofuturism, where we talk about Butler, Winter, and Wahili, where Butler does a great job of using narrative, fantasy, and stories to talk about structural antagonisms and Black survival skills to navigate utopian worlds, and how Winter does a great job. Sorry, I don't think Winter applied to, well, yeah, Winter didn't really apply to Afrofuturism. Sorry, I don't know why I threw that in there, but anyway, we also talked about Wahili and how Wahili allows for like this understanding of like habeas viscus and for this analysis of like tuning into the hieroglyphics of the flesh. And then also we talked about Watchmen, and that's what we talked about instead of Winter, wrong W. But we talked about Watchmen and how that's like an actual visualization of what it means to like place the subaltern Black into an alternate reality, which is the crux of Afrofuturism. It's the idea of putting Black people into different perspectives, into different temporalities, into different realities to theorize and question Black subjectivity or the possible Black subject formation and agency when we change the structures of the world. And it can be liberating for Black people, but it does not disavow the connection that we have to the current reality that we live in. Now, Black feminism is the last one that we talked about. And for that one, we talked about Collins, Lord, Hooks, Hartman, Spillers. All of these amazing authors are strong Black feminists. And Black feminism centers on the concept or the conversation about Black women and how Black women were integral to the establishment of the nation state, but it also allows for us to investigate the intricate relationship between sexism, patriarchy, and gender politics when we like look at the violence that was inflicted on the Black flesh, but then we also look at Black domestic households, and we look at the Black woman as being the mule of the world and forced to take on all the culpability of all of the problems of the world. Lastly, we talked about how can anti-Blackness work in tandem with other isms to shape other identities. And we realized like Blackness creates like this value system where again, Black is fungible. It is at the bottom. It's eradicated from existence, but yet it gives coherency to everything above it. And we have white, the pure, the privileged at the top, the superior at the top. And within that, proximity to Blackness, your proximity to the Black social location based on other theories, other isms, other structures, causes you to face different levels of violence throughout all of these communities. So when we talk about like classism, when we talk about sexism, when we talk about the patriarchy, when we talk about disabilities, when we're talking about them in the context of a white person, there's this commonality of still being white on the scale of anti-Blackness to whiteness. But the other ism, the other intersection that they're facing puts them at a level of violence that approximates them to anti-Blackness based on their ability to produce for society. Since anti-Blackness is unproductive, their ability to produce determines where they fall on the scale of value of this libidinal economy type exchange. So we can also think about like anti-Blackness, again, as we talked about in indigeneity, and that is where we talked about Sylvia Wynter, and we talked about her new book her book, Black Metamorphosis, and how she reconceptualizes what it means to be indigenous and native to land, based instead of like land-based politics, but your power relationship to the colonizer. And then we also talk about indigeneity in terms of like red, black, and white, or red, white, and black, the Wildersonian aspect of the indigenous as being half dead or half human because of the genocide that was inflicted in the clearing of the land, but still that open space to disconnect and disavow yourself from your culture and your identity to be integrated into civil society. So Blackness and settler colonialism definitely work in hand together. The clearing of the nation state happened by settler colonialism. The building of the nation state was created through anti-Blackness. So we cannot necessarily address one without fully addressing the other one. And anti-Blackness allows us to understand some of the intricacies and the reasons why settler colonialism happened how it did, but it also allows us to have the understanding of how other forms of violence, other isms shape other social locations and blacken different identities and their experiences to inflict violence on them. Because at the end of the day, the slave is what is inhuman. And again, to inflict violence on a human would be unmoral and unethical of the superior moral white supremacy state itself. So there has to be some level of dehumanization that happens that like creates these subjectivities to be closer to Blackness to allow for that violence to be inflicted. Okay, so that was a lot of conversation. I am so sorry that we went so over. I was just trying to make sure that we did a full conversation and address like as much as we possibly could about anti-Blackness, because it is a huge topic. And I'm sure there are plenty of questions, plenty of things that can have way more in-depth explanation. I know there's things that can have way more in-depth explanation. So please feel free to reach out to me whenever you would like to with any of the questions that you have. But that being said, let's jump into this activity for us to help us process everything that we talked about. And if you have any questions while going through it or thoughts that you would like to share with me, I would love for you to do so. But the activity that I would like us to do is first, if we're in groups, okay, partner up. Like if you're in a larger group, partner up in groups of 2, 3 would also work, but 3 at the max. Now, each person in that group, pick one of the theories that we discussed today. And each person pick a different theory. So someone could pick Afro-optimism, someone could pick Afro-pessimism, someone could pick Afro-futurism, or Black feminism. Pick one of those theories that we talked about and take a second to make sure you have you're comfortable with your concept of this theory. Now, one person is going to go first, and you're going to use your chosen theory to basically explain a mini affirmative. So give a uniqueness, use your theory to explain the positionality of Blackness, the context of the world, or how other identities are shaped in relation to anti-Blackness, which is absolutely fine as well. You could talk about settler colonialism through an settler colonialism and its like tandem with anti-Black structures or with anti-Blackness as well, whatever you feel more comfortable using. But what is your uniqueness? What is your framing for how the world operates based on the theory that you chose? Then make an idea of like, okay, so this is kind of what we should do to address it. And it could be a utopian thinking of we should do this huge thing to solve for all the problems of the world, or it could be minimalistic. And not to say like that's negative or less than, but it's something that is more about like an individual agency, an individual advocacy, something that is more like, oh, you can actually go out and do this today rather than theorizing the what ifs, right? And then last, you want to talk about like, why should we do this? Why is your plan, your theory, your advocacy going to change or have an effect on the structural antagonism that you are, like the structural antagonism, anti-Blackness, based on the theory that you are choosing to use to explain Blackness. So you'll want to make sure you reconnect your advocacy to like the warrants of why this would make a difference based on how Blackness operates, right? Or anti-Blackness operates. So you don't have to do like a whole speech that is as long as, you know, a normal 1AC would be, but make sure you take several minutes to like fully think about, okay, who's going to go first and be like the mini AF, and then who's going to be in like the other negative, or if you're in a group of three, like the negatives, right? So next, what you'll do after you explain your theory, the other person who picked a different theory or social like position is going to use their theory to first ask some questions, right? Cross-sex, this really helps us like pick our brain and understand. But then take a second, think about, okay, this is what they explained, and this is how my theory or understanding would poke holes or provide a different advocacy than what they chose. Now, this conversation does not have to be filled with warrants. You don't necessarily have to refer to the authors, do the best that you can do, but make it more of a conversation, right? So you can pick and prod and be like, okay, well, if you're saying like Afro-pessimism is this, but I'm defending Afro-optimism as that, and there's a possibility for us to like exist in alternate realities, would it not be better for us to tune into habeas viscus, tune into the flesh, than it would be for us to sit here and have like a analysis of these structures of anti-Black violence, or just to continue to narrate lost lives. And it doesn't have to be, like I said, fully warranted in terms of the conversation, but the goal of it is to just help you start to pick and discern what are the different conversations that can be had around anti-Blackness. So if there's like 3 people in the group, then you would pass it to the next person and they would do the same, where they would also talk about the other ideas and explain how in their theory, there would be a different set of actions taken. And go back and forth, at least have each person speak twice. So that way you can fully like digest the conversation, engage with each other, talk about the theories. And this will help us to understand the differences between each theory. Between each conversation, make sure that you have a cross-sex where you ask questions. If you don't know something, if you're curious about something, look it up. It's not like a debate round where you can't, you know, use your internet, but feel free to look it up and research it and say, hey, like, so I found out that this is actually like an aspect of what Wilderson is talking about. And I think that applies to like answer your question better. So take your time. This should take, you know, try to take at least like 20 minutes when doing this activity to like really break down some of the concepts that we talked about in this about 2-hour long lecture. Again, sorry about that. But if you're alone, then play like not devil's advocate, pick 2 sides and go back and forth between yourself. When you have questions, research it yourself and do this like by placing yourself in one position and then switching sides and also being the other position. But really make sure that like you're picking your mind as you're switching between the positions to point out what you think might be flaws, some truths that you may agree with in the arguments, and some commonalities that you may see within the arguments to make sure that you fully like are engaged and again digesting the material that we talked about. Now, if you have any questions in terms of some of the thoughts that you come up with while y'all are going like doing this activity, again, reach out to me. I would love to talk about it. And I hope you all enjoyed this lecture. I hope there was some valuable information and we're at least a little bit more clear on what anti-Blackness is, some of the theories that revolve around anti-Blackness, and then some of the ways that other communities also relate to anti-Blackness. Thank you.